Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. It must be about 10 minutes since I talked about Blackstone Fortress, so I'm going to talk about Blackstone Fortress. Why not? And in fact, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about house rules. And this is something that I've mentioned a few times in previous videos, and several people have commented and said that they would like to know what sort of house rules I am using. Now, most of my house rules are for making the game more difficult, and Games Workshop did, not so long ago, release the Blackstone Fortress Abominable Intellect pack, and this was actually their attempt to add difficulty to the game. And if anybody's watched my review of this card pack, I wasn't particularly impressed, and I think a lot of people probably agreed with me, or at least could see where I was coming from, although there may be a few people who thought I was a little bit too harsh on the cards. But one of the main things that the cards did was increase the number of enemies on the board. And I think that's a pretty cynical and very boring way to try to increase difficulty. And as I covered in that video, in a lot of cases, I don't think it even really increases the difficulty. It just changes the structure of the combat slightly. So adding more plastic to the board is not my idea of a solution for increasing difficulty. Furthermore, I don't like house rules that completely re-engineer a game. I like Blackstone Fortress the way it is. And I guess I should point out as well that I'm not one of the people that finds the game stupidly easy. I think it's a game that's quite laid back and occasionally has spikes of difficulty that can put you in trouble. So I don't find it a cakewalk, but I do appreciate that it's not a real strong challenge and it's not a consistent challenge. You will go through phases where everything's sort of going your way and it's relatively easy, and once you've got some decent equipment and you know your tactics, it does get easier. And I don't think the game scales as well as it should as you get more competent at the game. I don't think it adds enough for you to deal with in that respect. But yeah, when I'm adding house rules, I don't want to completely re-engineer a game that I love. I don't see the point in doing that. So house rules for me have to be very simple. I like simple games anyway, so I'm not going to add anything that adds undue complications. Let's get started. So here we have the initiative tracker, and my first group of house rules are related to the initiative track and setting up combats and dealing with spawn groups. And I should mention that most of these house rules I've used, a couple are ones that I'm toying with the idea, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend you do all of these at once. This is a grab bag of ideas that you may or may not wish to try. So first of all, when you're populating a combat, you draw encounter cards. You draw them one at a time, and it tells you what type of enemy is spawning where on the board. I will assume that anybody watching this video knows how Blackstone Fortress works. So, for example, here is a card spawning Chaos Beastmen. So if this was the first card that I drew, it says 4 Chaos Beastmen spawning at point 1, so that is what I would do, and I would put that card there. And now I have the second card, which also says Chaos Beastmen, and it wants me to spawn 4 Chaos Beastmen at spawn point 2. But I don't have any Chaos Beastmen left. The simple solution here is to discard that card and draw whatever comes next. And in this case, it's 2 Spindle Drones. It's a very simple thing to do. The rules actually say spawn what you can, and then just disregard the rest. I'm okay with doing that if you can do a partial group. So if I had 3 Chaos Beastmen in one, and then there was supposed to be another 2 Chaos Beastmen, then I would have 3 on the first one and 1 on the second one. I'm okay with that. Because there's another idea that I'm sort of toying with that I will mention in a moment. But if you can't spawn a group at all, I think it's worth redrawing rather than having the blank group. So that is what I would do in this case. So let's say we get a spindle drones, 2 spindle drones there. And oh look, spawn point 3 is another 1 spindle drone. It's almost like I picked these cards out on purpose. House rule number 2 involves the Abominable Intellect pack that I mentioned earlier. I haven't actually done this yet, but the idea that I am toying with doing at some point is that once you have spawned all of your enemies, once you've created all the spawn points for the game, you draw 1 of the Abominable Intellect cards and you apply the twist. In this case, it would be wave after wave, subtract 10 from all reinforcement rolls in this combat to a minimum of 1. So you get a twist that stays in effect for the rest of the combat. And every card in the Abominable Intellect pack has one of those twists. So it's an easy thing to do, just to draw one of those cards, just to add an extra layer of challenge for the conflict. The third thing isn't so much a house rule as just a bit of bookkeeping to keep things tidy and organised. When a group of enemies activates, the first thing that will happen is there will be a spawn roll. And this is something that has caused some confusion with some people, because you only do a reinforcement roll for a spawn group if enemies from that group have been slain. So what I do, it's not mentioned in the rules to do this, but what I do is when an enemy is killed from a group, I will actually take the enemy and I will place it on the group that it came from. So when it gets to the point of activating that group, I can get an immediate visual representation of the potential amount of reinforcements that can come onto the board. I know whether there's reinforcements available. It's a quick way of keeping track of that sort of thing. However, one of the things that I find most tiresome about the game, and this is particularly a problem if you have large groups of traitor guardsmen, is keeping track of which enemies on the board come from which spawn group. You can do things like you can put coloured bands around them, you can paint the miniatures up in different groups, and then try your best to make sure that ones that are painted in similar colours spawn together. But there's something else that I'm thinking of trying. I haven't done it yet. But I'm sort of toying with the idea of a hive mind type situation, which will significantly increase the threat if you have more than one group of the same type on the board. And it's actually an idea that I kind of half-inched from the Dungeons & Dragons adventure game system, where if there is more than one of a certain type of enemy on the board, they all activate every time one of them would get a chance to activate. So in this particular example we've got here, let me move that little dude out of the way. In this particular case here, the Chaos Beastmen would activate, and then when this group of spindle drones would activate, all spindle drones on the board would activate. And then when it came to this group of spindle drones activating, all spindle drones on the board would activate again. This does increase the number of activations, so the number of rolls on the activation table. So it's a little bit more dice rolling, there's a little bit more to keep track of, but you don't have to keep such a close eye on where the models are coming from and where they go back to when they die, because basically it would be a case that as they die, you would just fill up groups from the left. So you would place the initial kills on this one until you've got 2 on there, and then you would start filling up this card with additional kills. And reinforcements would only come back from the card that is activating at that time. Like I say, I haven't done it yet. I'm not sure whether the increased number of activations for units would be devastating for the heroes or not. Is something that I would need to test. But yeah, something that I'm considering doing. 1, to get rid of that extra bit of bookkeeping, but 2, just to put extra pressure on. I like the idea of groups of traitor guardsmen being in radio communication with each other, so when one team activates, the other team will move in response as well. And I also like the idea of some of the things like the Urgles having like a hive mind intelligence that makes them move as a pack. Is something that I think has a nice narrative element to it, whilst also having the potential to increase the difficulty of the challenge of each combat that you face. So the next set of house rules I want to discuss relate to the actual combat and how enemies move around. When an enemy activates, quite often you get a choice of exactly how that activation works. For example, you may get an action that says target the closest enemy, and if there are two enemies that are of the same distance, you get to pick which one. The leader of the group for that particular turn gets that decision. So it can be possible to be a little bit gamey and make an enemy target the character that it's less likely to hurt. And obviously that is the best tactic to do. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at a way of the enemies actually making some of those decisions on their own behalf, taking those decision points out of your hands in order to force the enemies to take what would be potentially their most logical choice. It's kind of a hunting the weakness mechanism. First of all, it's a choice between is an enemy in cover or is an enemy not in cover. In this particular situation, we have one guardsman, UR025 is not in cover, whereas the Kroot tracker is in cover. This guardsman, if he's going to take a shot or if he's going to charge at someone, he's more likely going to see the big dude out in the open as the priority target, because he may not even be able to see this dude if he's crouched down behind a wall or whatever. If both targets are out in the open or both targets are behind cover, then the secondary consideration will be the target that you are most likely to be able to damage. So you would go for the target with the least armor, the lowest armor roll. In this particular case, UR025 has an armor defense of a D12 compared to Dayak Grek, who has a defense of a D6. If we're in this situation, for example, where they're both in cover, the guardsman would take the shot at the Kroot tracker. If that still doesn't make it a deciding factor, if, for example, both targets have the same defense value, then the enemy will target whichever character has the most wounds. So again, smelling the blood, whichever target is most likely to die from the attack. And if that still doesn't work out, then the leader will just have to make a decision. One of the reasons why I wanted to have this system where the enemy would make that decision is because of the onslaught action, which basically says you target an enemy and then you get to attack again, and you can target the same enemy or you can target a different enemy that's of equal distance. And I just think that if an enemy is attacking in an onslaught situation, they're going to focus on a particular character and they're going to keep attacking the same character. So with onslaught, both attacks would be against the same character. This also stops you being able to game the system and say, okay, well, if he takes a second attack, he might die, so I'll make sure the second attack goes off on a different character. It's just something that it makes you have to think a little bit more about where you're putting your weaker characters and making a little bit better use of cover, because cover being that first tiebreak situation will be more effective as a shield. So, you know, you put out your damage soak in the open, and then your squishy folk duck down. It seems to be in keeping with how a group like this would act in the real world, and it gets those situations where you don't split attacks just to stop particular characters dying. Next up, we have a change to how damage is applied to enemies when you attack them. The first, and the one that I've mentioned quite a few times, is that I nerf crits. Normally, when you attack, let's say, for example, that Dayak Grek wants to shoot this traitor guardsman with his Kroot rifle. He would roll his D12. If he rolls a single pip, then he does 1 wound. if he rolls 2 pips, he makes a critical strike and actually inflicts 3 wounds. Now, I'm not sure why they did triple damage on crits, because I think it makes more sense for it to be 2. And that's because a lot of enemies get an additional wound under certain circumstances. For example, the traitor guardsmen have 2 wounds as standard. However, if you put a traitor sergeant on the board, he gets an additional wound, so that puts his wounds up to 3. That additional wound doesn't really achieve anything if you get a critical strike, because you're inflicting 3 wounds, so 3 wounds will kill a sergeant just the same as it would kill a grunt. I feel like that sergeant should have a little bit more staying power. And again, it's the same with any enemy that has 3 wounds. If you score a crit, they're just as squishy as the weaker enemies that only have 2 wounds. I feel like there should be a step up from that. So guardsmen have 2 wounds, so if you get a crit on a guardsman and inflict 2 wounds with a crit, then they still go down. But a sergeant would be injured but still in the fight. Tougher enemies would be injured but still in the fight. I think that's a better way of doing it. I think double damage is better than triple damage. So that's what I do with crits. Every crit is worth 2 wounds on an enemy. And that just makes certain characters, it gives them a little bit more longevity. They stick around for a little bit longer. They're a little bit more robust. An alternative to crits that I've been thinking about but haven't done, and the reason I haven't done it is because it involves more dice rolling. But what I was thinking of doing was, if you roll a crit, so in this case, if we roll our d12 and get 2 pips, that would be a crit. What you would do is you would get to roll all of your attack dice again, and then you would take the highest result from your attack and add the number of pips to the damage inflicted. Basically, we roll our dice, we get a crit, so we've done a hit, which would be 1 wound as standard. We then get to roll the dice again. If we roll 1 pip, then we add 1 to the damage, and it's 2. If we roll 2 pips, we add 2 to the damage, and therefore get 3, which is the standard amount at the moment for a critical attack. And if you roll a blank, you would just do your 1 base damage. So what that does, it does mean that in certain situations, and in quite a few situations, your critical damage is no better than your regular damage, but it does mean you get a little bit more variability. So sometimes a crit might do 2, sometimes it might do 3. It's, again, something that I haven't done yet. It's something I'm still thinking about. I'm wondering if the number of blanks on the dice means that a crit just wouldn't be as powerful as it could be. Something that I need to explore a little bit more. The final change to how combat works is the introduction of armor. I've looked at lots of different ways of adding armor to the game, and I think the simplest way to do it is to add armor based on the size of your target. There are 3 sizes of target in the game. There's small, like a traitor guardsman, then there is large, and then there is massive. So things like the amble are massive. And there are 3 grades of dice. There's a d12, a d8, and a d6. So perhaps the simplest way to apply armor is to say that any massive targets get a d12 armor save. Any large targets get a d8 armor save. And any small targets get a d6 armor save. That was my original thought. However, I've since adapted this a little more. I think having everything have an armor save adds a lot of extra dice rolling to the game, and it can really increase how robust the enemies are, and particularly the d12 armor saves on the big guys. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm not worrying about the d12, and I'm saying the huge massive enemies get a d8 armor save, the large enemies get a d6 armor save, and the small enemies don't get an armor save at all. So the poor old guardsmen and things like that are still just as squishy as they've always been. But of course, in conjunction with the nerf on the crits, with crits only causing 2 wounds instead of 3, small enemies are a little bit more solid anyway. So that's how I'm doing armor saves and damage. The final house rule is something I'm not doing at the moment, and it's because I'm in two minds about it. It's relating to retinue characters, which were introduced in Escalation and have since appeared in White Dwarf magazine. There's been a couple of retinue characters. There's been an orc and a couple of ogrins. Retinue characters get added to your party. You have to unlock them by doing a mission, and once you've unlocked them, at the start of an expedition, you can choose to take one retinue character with you. And the retinue character gets an activation immediately after the leader each round, and will follow their own set of guidelines and instructions. And they can be incredibly useful and incredibly powerful. And this was particularly the case with this chap from the Escalation expansion and also the Ogren brothers from White Dwarf. They were incredibly powerful, and there was no real downside to having them on your team. It was like the best new item you could have, because they get their own set of activations, their own set of attacks, and it's a dual activation as well, because they always activate immediately after the leader. You could do stuff with the leader and then know that you were immediately going to get another activation with your retinue character to help get your leader out of a bind if there were problems. So it seemed like they were very powerful, made the game a lot easier. So I was thinking that there should be some kind of cost involved with retinue characters. So I was thinking that it would be the case that when you return to Precipice, the leader, who would actually be the person who was controlling the retinue character on the last turn before you left and went back to Precipice, would have to pay the retinue character. So your discovery card of lowest value would have to be given to the retinue character, and that would just be discarded, returned to the box as a payment. But also, in doing that payment and dealing with the retinue character, that character wouldn't be able to go and do anything else in Precipice for that return visit. That's what I was thinking. So you have to. There is a cost involved in taking that retinue character. I'm slightly in two minds about it now, because the most recent White Dwarf retinue character was the orc, and the orc he already has an inbuilt cost in taking him, because he's crazy, and if you stand yourself in the wrong position, he'll shoot you while he's shooting the enemy, because he doesn't care. He'll just shoot through you to shoot the enemy, and sometimes when you want to leave, he'll just stick around and just carry on shooting. So he already has kind of like his own cost. He brings massive amounts of firepower, but at the risk of being a pain. So it would almost seem a little bit unfair to then make the person who was controlling him have to discard a discovery card and give up their turn in Precipice. So maybe it would just be the case that you have to pay a retinue character a discovery card just to keep them, like a retaining fee. That's something, again, that I'm still thinking about. But there we go. So I guess that's it at the moment. Those are the main things that I've been toying with. The main ways that I've been trying to adjust the way the game plays, adjust the difficulty. Like I say, I don't use all of them all the time. Some of them I haven't even tried out yet. I've just included them, almost just to get the ideas out there to see what other people think. But I hope some people have found this video interesting. I do apologise. I've got a bit of a cold at the moment, so I'm really struggling to get through this video. But hopefully this has been useful, and some people might be able to take some of these ideas, maybe adapt them for their own group, their own play style, or maybe improve on them, or just disregard them as silly nonsense. Whatever you do with these ideas, thank you very much for watching and sticking with me up till now. If you have liked the video, please consider pressing the like button, and if you have really liked the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I will see you all again very soon. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.